It was the fall of 2016 when I decided to spend a few days alone at a cabin that belonged to a distant cousin of mine. The place hadn't been used in years, and he had passed away a while back, leaving the property mostly forgotten. It sat in a remote part of Southern Virginia, a few miles from the North Carolina border, way off the main roads, hidden between stretches of overgrown pine trees and hardwoods. The cabin sat right next to an old, overgrown graveyard that had maybe a dozen or so headstones, some leaning sideways and some completely covered in vines and moss. My cousin used to say the graves belonged to early settlers from the 1800s. I didn't think much of it. They weren't marked with much besides worn-down names and dates. No tall stories, no creepy history, just forgotten people buried in the woods. I had taken time off work after a rough stretch. I was 32 then, working construction in northern Tennessee. I needed time away from everything. My plan was simple: just hike around during the day, fish a little, and sit by the fire at night. There was no electricity at the cabin, no running water either. Just an old pump out back, a fireplace, and a single-room layout with a creaky floor and dusty furniture. A couple of broken-down chairs, a table, a rusty bed frame, and a shed out back that looked like it hadn't been opened in 20 years. The first day was uneventful. I parked my truck down a dirt path and walked in with a backpack and a few supplies. I had a small cooler with some food, a sleeping bag, and a flashlight with extra batteries. The air was cool, and the leaves had started to turn. I settled in fast. I cleared out some cobwebs, opened the front and back doors to let the stale air out, and walked around the property to get a feel for the place. The graveyard sat maybe 20 yards from the front steps of the cabin, just down a little hill past a line of low shrubs. The stones were so faded I had to get real close to make anything out. Some of the names were nearly unreadable. One of them had a carving of a lamb on top, probably a child's grave. Another just said "Mother" in big letters. That night, I built a small fire in the old brick fireplace. Took a bit of effort, but I managed. The sound of the wind moving through the trees and the distant calls of night birds filled the silence. It felt peaceful at first, quiet in a way I hadn't felt in years. But something about that silence also felt heavy, like it was pressing down on the cabin from all sides. Around midnight, I woke up cold. The fire had died down to glowing coals. I heard something faint outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind again, but after a few seconds, I realized it was more steady, soft, crunching footsteps on dry leaves. It came from the direction of the graveyard. I held still and listened. They stopped for a moment, then started again, closer now. I sat up in the bed slowly, trying not to make any noise. The cabin had no curtains, and the moonlight spilled in through the small window above the table. I couldn't see anything from where I sat, but I felt the skin on my arms tighten. I reached into my bag and pulled out the flashlight. I didn't turn it on yet. I just waited. The steps stopped again. This time I heard a dry, scraping sound, like something being dragged. I stood up, careful not to make the floor creak too much, and moved toward the window. I looked out across the clearing toward the graveyard, but I couldn't see anything, just shadows and trees. I didn't sleep much after that. I stayed awake until the morning light started coming through the trees. The next day, I walked down to the graveyard again. I saw something new, a small pile of fresh dirt near one of the older graves. It wasn't a new grave exactly, more like someone had disturbed the ground, maybe dug something up. The soil looked loose, darker than the rest. I didn't touch it. I just stood there looking at it for a long time. There weren't any animal prints, no tools, no sign of someone camping nearby. It didn't make sense. I spent the rest of that day trying to distract myself. I went down to a nearby stream to fish, brought back a couple of small bass, cooked them over the fire. But my thoughts kept drifting back to the graveyard. I kept thinking about the dragging sound I'd heard, about the dirt, about who would even come all the way out here just to mess with an old grave. That night, I stayed up late with the flashlight by my side. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the noise again. This time it was louder. It sounded like something heavy being moved slowly through dry leaves, and it was definitely closer than before. I stood up and turned on the flashlight, aiming it through the window. The beam caught movement near the edge of the graveyard, just a flash of something low to the ground, maybe the shape of a person crouching. But the light hit the brush and reflected back too much glare to see clearly. I felt my chest tighten. My instinct told me not to go outside, so I stayed put, sitting on the bed with my back against the wall, flashlight still in my hand. The dragging sound continued for a few more minutes, then stopped completely. By morning, I went back down to the graveyard. Another grave had been disturbed. Same thing. Fresh pile of soil, no prints, nothing left behind. It was a different spot this time, one I hadn't looked at before. I remember reading part of the stone. Someone named Eliza, buried in 1873. It looked like the top of the grave had been partially dug up, maybe 6 or 7 inches deep, then left like that. I started thinking maybe someone local knew about the cabin and was messing with me. But there were no tire marks, no boot prints, nothing. The dirt around the graves was smooth except for the fresh piles. I checked around the cabin too. No signs of anyone coming close, no trash or tools, no broken branches or trampled brush. I told myself I'd leave the next day. I just needed to get through one more night. That evening, I made sure the fire burned longer. I sat outside on the porch until it got too cold, watching the tree line. I had a hunting knife with me. Not that it would have helped much, but it made me feel a bit better. I didn't hear anything that night until around 3 in the morning. Then I heard something slam against the side of the cabin. Not a knock, not a branch falling. Something hard hitting the wood. I jumped up, flashlight already in my hand, and pointed it at the wall. Then I slowly opened the door and stepped outside. There was nothing there, but down by the graveyard I saw someone. A figure crouched near one of the stones. I shouted, but they didn't move. I started down the hill with the flashlight aimed at them, but they stood up suddenly and bolted into the woods. I couldn't see their face, just the shape of them running. I didn't chase them. I just stood there, flashlight shaking in my hand. I walked over to the grave. Same thing, fresh dirt, half dug. But this time, there was something on top of the mound. A rusty metal tag, the kind you'd see on old dog collars or tools. I picked it up and wiped off the dirt. It had the word belonging stamped into it. That was enough for me. By sunrise, I had my things packed. I didn't eat, didn't check the graveyard again. I walked back to my truck and drove out, not stopping until I hit the main road. Later, I told a friend about it, and he said maybe it was someone robbing old graves for metal or looking for old family heirlooms buried with the dead. That explanation made sense, at least more than anything else I could think of. I never went back to that cabin. A few months later, I heard that the property had been bought by someone from out of state. They put up a fence around the graveyard, tore the cabin down, and started building some kind of hunting lodge. Even now, I think about those nights, about the slow sounds of dirt being moved, the dragging, and that word on the tag, belonging. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it was just a twisted joke by someone out there. But I know what I felt out there, and it wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something that didn't feel like it belonged in daylight. Something that crawled just under the surface of normal life. And whatever it wasn't finished. Not yet. It was early October of 2013, and I had just taken a temporary assignment as a seasonal park ranger in Idaho, stationed near the northern edge of Clearwater National Forest. I was 33 then, recently divorced, and I thought the job would help clear my head. The cabin they assigned me was an old one, built decades ago, maybe in the 70s, up near Elk Point, deep in the woods where foot traffic drops off. I was alone up there, just me, the pine trees, and the quiet. I had been in the cabin for about 3 weeks before anything unusual happened. The days were quiet. I did what I was supposed to do: check the trails, log any animal sightings, keep an eye out for campers, and monitor the weather station. At night, I'd cook something simple, sit by the wood stove, and sometimes read old ranger logs that were kept in a metal cabinet under the desk. The logs went back to the early 90s, and most of them were boring trail maintenance reports, equipment checklists, sightings of deer or bear. But every now and then, there were strange entries, vague notes about trespassers, tools going missing, and some pages even torn out. Nothing ever directly said what happened, just notes like "follow-up needed" or "camp at mile marker 12 cleared again." At first, I didn't think much of it. Forest work attracts all types. Some people are quiet and paranoid, others a little overzealous. I figured the strange entries were just the result of long shifts and isolation. The cabin itself was a small structure, about 20 feet by 20 feet. Just a single room with a desk, a cot, shelves of gear, a propane stove, and a wood-burning heater. There was a steel door with a deadbolt, and all the windows had shutters you could latch from inside. The place wasn't cozy, but it was sturdy. There was also a small shed about 30 feet behind the cabin where tools and extra gear were stored. That was always kept locked. The first thing that unsettled me happened during a night of heavy rain. I remember the sound of the wind pushing hard against the trees, the rain hammering the metal roof. I couldn't sleep, so I stayed up reading one of the old logbooks. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something outside, slow crunching sounds, like footsteps moving across the wet gravel near the shed. At first I thought it might be a bear, so I got up quietly and looked through the peephole in the front door. I couldn't see anything, just black trees and rain falling sideways. I waited. The sound stopped. I stood there in the dark for a while, listening. Eventually, I went back to the cot and sat down. Maybe 10 minutes later, I heard it again. Slow, steady movement around the back of the cabin. Not fast, not loud, but too heavy to be a raccoon. I got up again, this time slipped on my boots and grabbed the flashlight from the shelf. When I opened the door, I felt the cold hit me. The wind was strong. I pointed the flashlight around, moving it slow across the trees, then toward the back of the cabin. Nothing, just rain hitting the mud. I checked the shed too, still locked tight. I stood out there a few minutes longer, then went back inside and locked the door. The sounds didn't come back that night, but I barely slept. The next morning, I did a walk around of the area. I didn't find any tracks, but the ground was soaked and soft. Near the back wall of the cabin, I noticed something strange. One of the wooden boards that lined the bottom half of the structure looked newer than the others. Different color, different grain, like it had been replaced. I hadn't noticed that before. I bent down and knocked on it. Hollow. When I checked the inside of the cabin in that spot, there was nothing, just the back wall and the shelf with firewood. But it stayed in my mind. It felt off. A few nights later, something else happened. I woke up in the dark to the sound of knocking. Not on the front door. It was tapping, faint, quick tapping on the window to the left of the cot. That window had a shutter. I was sure I had latched it before bed, like I always did. I sat up and listened. The tapping kept going. I waited maybe 2 minutes before grabbing the flashlight and slowly stepping over to the window. I opened the shutter fast and shined the beam out. Nothing but trees and mist. The fog had rolled in heavy that night. I shut the shutter and latched it tight. After that, I started keeping my boots on at night and sleeping with the flashlight under my pillow. I also started locking the deadbolt on the shed. It was strange how I had this feeling, like I wasn't alone out there, but there was never anything solid to grab onto. No tracks, no damage, nothing clear. Then one morning I went to the shed to check on some equipment, and I noticed the padlock was missing. Not broken, just gone. The door wasn't open, but it wasn't latched right either. I opened it slowly and scanned the shelves. One of the axes was missing. That made my stomach drop. I stood there for a while just staring at the empty space where it should have been. I looked around the area but found nothing. No footprints. No sign of forced entry. That night, I locked the cabin tight and stacked the firewood against the door. I didn't sleep. I just sat on the cot with the flashlight and the flare gun in my hand. The rain came again around 1 a.m., and the wind shook the trees. Around 3, I heard footsteps, clear this time, slow, deliberate. They circled the cabin. At one point, the handle on the front door rattled. I held my breath, heart pounding, and aimed the flashlight at the door. The rattling stopped, and everything went still. Then I heard movement near the back again. I moved toward the rear wall and pressed my ear to it. The sound was soft, almost like scratching or dragging. It went on for maybe 10 seconds and then stopped. After that, nothing. I stayed frozen there until sunrise. When it got light, I checked everything again.
No footprints.
No marks on the door. But the new board on the back wall, that one that didn't match, was different. The nails were loose. I don't know why I did it, but I pried the board off with the flat end of a crowbar. Behind the board was a small square space, like a shallow compartment built into the wall. And inside it was a roll of plastic, maybe 2 feet long, wrapped in black trash bags and duct tape. I pulled it out and set it on the table. I didn't open it for a long time. I just stared at it. My hands were shaking. When I finally unwrapped it, I found what looked like part of an old uniform. Faded green fabric, maybe a park ranger jacket. It was stained. Beneath it were 2 old ID tags, one cracked, both belonging to a ranger named James Carver. I remembered the name from one of the older logbooks. He had entries from around 2006 and then nothing. The logs just stopped. That was it.
No bones.
No blood. But the implication was enough. Someone had hidden that stuff. Someone didn't want it found. I packed my things that day. I didn't file a report. I didn't want to answer questions I couldn't explain. I locked the cabin and drove the forest road back toward Highway 12. When I hit cell service, I called the ranger station and told them I was leaving the assignment early. I didn't give a reason. I looked up James Carver weeks later. No records.
No obituary.
No news. Just a name on a few old logs. Sometimes I wonder if someone's still out there, living in the forest, watching that cabin. Or maybe using it. Maybe I caught them off guard, and they never meant for me to find that hidden compartment. I'll never go back to that part of Idaho. I still dream about the tapping on the window, and I still think about the footsteps in the rain, moving slow like whoever it was had all the time in the world. I was 27 the year I drove up to that part of northern Idaho alone. It was fall, late October, and the leaves were already gone from the trees. The air had that thin, sharp feel to it, like the whole world was holding its breath before winter rolled in for good. I had just left a job in Spokane after a burnout-level stretch of nonstop shifts. I needed air, quiet, something to shake off the noise. A buddy from a camping forum had mentioned this route before, near Avery, not far from the Montana border. He said there were a few stretches of trail that still had some of the old timber roads branching off, mostly overgrown now, but a few you could drive if you had good clearance and didn't mind scratches on the paint. I didn't. I had an old '08 Tacoma that already looked like it had been through a war. I left early, around 5 a.m., and by the time I turned off the main road and onto the forest road, it was already past noon. The trail narrowed as I went deeper in, and it looked like no one had come through for a long time. Tire tracks were nearly non-existent, just broken twigs, small piles of pine needles, and thick brush reaching in from both sides. I kept going anyway. Something about the silence out there felt clean. A few more miles in, I spotted a barely visible path veering off to the right. It looked like it had been a logging road decades ago. Trees had grown up through it in places, but there was just enough room to squeeze through. I crept along at maybe 5 miles an hour. After another half hour, the trail opened up into a clearing, flat ground, moss-covered stumps, and a collapsed old would shed off to one side. But what stopped me cold was the cabin. It sat maybe 40 feet from the edge of the clearing, partially hidden under a cluster of tall pines. The roof had started to sink in the middle. The chimney had crumbled on one side. The porch sagged down hard on the left like it had been trying to give up for years. Windows were boarded from the inside, but the wood was old and grayed out. It was the kind of place that made you want to step lighter. Like something inside it had been forgotten long enough to get angry. I parked at the edge of the clearing and got out. The wind had stopped completely.
No birds. No rustling.
Just me and the sound of my boots crunching dead pine needles. I walked toward the cabin and circled it once. The back door was gone, just hanging hinges and rot. Inside, I saw busted furniture, what looked like the remains of a wood stove, and walls that had bowed outward from years of freeze and thaw. There was graffiti in the back, names, dates, some junk carved into the wood. Most of it looked old. The most recent was from 2003. That date stuck in my head, maybe because it meant someone had been here. 22 years ago. Not yesterday, not last week, but still. I set up camp in the clearing but closer to my truck. Even though I told myself the cabin was just a structure, it still had this presence, like it didn't want me near it. I built a fire and made coffee, trying to shake the weird unease that had settled in my stomach. Around 6 p.m., the sun dipped behind the ridge and the cold came hard. I threw on my heavier jacket and started poking around more. I didn't go into the cabin, didn't need to. I could see enough through the broken back wall. What caught my eye was a small trail behind the cabin that led into thicker trees. It wasn't much of a trail anymore, just a slight dip in the land, but it looked walked. I followed it. About 50 yards in, I found what looked like an old root cellar. The door was partly open. One hinge had rusted off completely, and the wood had gone soft. I pulled it open the rest of the way and shined my flashlight down. Stairs led into complete blackness. I couldn't see the bottom. The air that came up smelled like mold, old dirt, and something sour, something I couldn't place. I told myself I'd check it out in the morning, safer in daylight. I headed back to camp, cooked a can of stew, and tried to calm my brain down. The whole place felt wrong, and I knew it wasn't just my imagination. I've camped alone more times than I can count. Deserts, forests, mountains, but this was the first time I actually felt watched. I barely slept. I'd drift off, then wake to the smallest noise. A branch snapping, what sounded like a footstep, wind that didn't feel like wind. Around 3 a.m., I heard something close to the truck, real close, metal clinking softly. I froze in my sleeping bag. I knew that sound. It was the door handle. I sat up slow and grabbed the knife I kept in my boot. I didn't move, didn't even breathe heavy. I just listened. The sound stopped after a while, maybe 2 minutes, could have been less. Then the crunch of slow footsteps, moving away. I didn't sleep after that. As soon as the light broke through the trees, I was up. I checked around the truck. Nothing was stolen, but there were prints in the soft dirt on the passenger side. Not boots, bare feet, big, dirty, and long-toed. Not animal, human, or close enough. I followed them slowly around the edge of the clearing. They went back toward the cabin and then vanished behind it, heading in the direction of that root cellar. I didn't want to go back there, but I did. This time I went down the steps, slowly, with a headlamp and a flashlight. The steps creaked and sagged but held. At the bottom was a narrow room, maybe 10 feet wide, 20 feet long, dirt walls, rotted shelves on either side, and junk. Rusted cans, torn fabric, cracked jars with things inside I didn't want to look at. But what hit me hardest was the smell, like meat left out too long, wet and wrong. On the far wall was something that didn't make sense. A chain bolted into the dirt and stone. Heavy, thick iron chain, the kind you use to lock machinery. It wasn't attached to anything now, but it had been. And the dirt floor near it was stained darker than the rest, like something had been sitting, or lying, there a long time. I turned and got out fast. Something about that chain felt personal, like whoever had lived here had kept something. Someone down there, or maybe they used to go down there willingly and stopped coming back up. Either way, I didn't want to be part of that story. Back at camp, I packed everything. Fast. I didn't care about the rest of the trail or spending another day in the woods. That place had history, and not the kind you talk about at bars. I got in the truck, turned the key, and started backing out. Right before I hit the trail, I saw something in the mirror, in the doorway of the cabin. It was a man, or used to be. He was tall, thin, shirtless even though it was below freezing, and covered in what looked like ash or dirt or both. His arms were long, too long. He stood perfectly still, eyes black from the shadow or maybe something worse. His mouth hung slightly open, just enough to see he wasn't smiling. I hit the gas, didn't stop for hours, didn't look back. I reported the sight to the local ranger station when I hit the highway. I didn't say much, just that there was an abandoned structure with possible human activity. I didn't mention the man. I didn't mention the chain. I didn't want questions. I wanted to forget. 2 weeks later, I called the ranger station again, just out of curiosity. They said they sent a guy up and couldn't find the cabin. Said the road probably washed out or overgrew again. Said I must have taken a wrong turn. But I know what I saw, and I'll never go back. Whatever was in that place, whatever was still alive out there, it didn't want company. And it had been left alone long enough to forget what it meant to be human. And maybe that's the scariest part of it all. Some people choose to disappear, and sometimes they wait in silence for someone else to take their place. It was late October of 2018 when I decided to take a solo trip up to a small hunting cabin that belonged to a guy I used to work with in Idaho. His name was Marshall. He had moved to Montana the year before and told me I could use the place whenever I wanted. It sat about 2 miles off the nearest gravel road, up near the edge of Clearwater National Forest. It wasn't anything fancy, just a single-room shack with a wood stove, a bunk, and a couple of hooks on the wall.
No plumbing.
No cell service. Just quiet, cold air and miles of thick pine all around. I was 32 at the time and working as a diesel mechanic in Boise. I wasn't exactly outdoorsy, but I had hunted whitetail with my uncle when I was younger, and I figured I could use a break from the city. I borrowed a .308 rifle from a coworker, packed a cooler with meat, bread, water, and some canned stuff and headed out early on a Friday morning. I left my truck parked behind a line of tall brush off the gravel road and hiked the rest of the way in. It was already cold that time of year, especially in the early mornings. The air had that sharp, dry feel that cracks your lips and makes your hands go raw if you're not careful. The trail up to the cabin wasn't marked, but I had GPS on an old Garmin unit, and Marshall had drawn me a map months back. It was overgrown and narrow, but I found the place just fine. It was smaller than I remembered. Slanted roof, single window on the front side, rust on the hinges. Some firewood already stacked by the door. I unlocked the padlock and stepped inside. It smelled like dry cedar and dust. There were a few old hunting magazines on a shelf, a half-used propane lantern, a broken mousetrap in the corner. I spent the first hour unpacking and getting a small fire going in the stove. After that, I walked out behind the cabin to get a feel for the area. There were tree stands deeper in the woods, probably left by whoever hunted the area before Marshall. The ground was damp from an earlier rain, and every step made a soft, sticky sound. I found some deer tracks by the base of a ridge about 500 yards out and made a mental note to return there before first light. That night, I ate cold beans and sat on the edge of the bunk, listening to the wind scrape across the roof. The woods out there had a different kind of silence. It wasn't peaceful, it was heavy, the kind that makes your ears ring because there's nothing else filling the air. No cars, no hum of electricity, just wind, the crack of tree branches, and once in a while, the faint sound of something moving through the brush. I didn't sleep much that night. Around 2 a.m., I heard something near the side wall of the cabin. It wasn't loud, just this soft, crunching sound like slow footsteps over dead leaves. At first, I thought it might be a deer or maybe a raccoon nosing around for food, but it kept going, circling the cabin once, then stopping behind it. I sat there in the dark for over an hour, staring at the door with my rifle across my lap. Eventually, the sound faded, and I talked myself into believing it was just some animal. I dozed off close to dawn and woke up freezing with a cramp in my leg. That morning, I geared up and hiked back out to the ridge where I saw the tracks. I set up near a downed log and waited. The wind was still and sharp. I didn't see anything all morning. Around 10, I started making my way back to the cabin. When I reached the trail near the clearing, I noticed something odd. There were tracks on the path, not hoof prints, boots, deep, wide tread, heading toward the cabin. I hadn't seen anyone out there, no trucks by the road, no sign of people, and I knew damn well those prints weren't mine. Mine had a narrower tread. I bent down to look closer. The prints were fresh. The ground was still soft underneath, and there were no pine needles covering them. Whoever it was had passed through within the last couple hours. I stood there for a while, listening. Nothing. No movement. No sound of steps, no voices. Just wind and trees. I followed the prints up toward the cabin, staying off the trail as much as I could. My hands were sweating inside my gloves, even though it was cold out. As I got closer, I crouched behind a tree and stared at the cabin. The door was still shut. No broken lock. No one outside. I waited another 10 minutes before walking up. I unlocked the door and slowly pushed it open, rifle ready. Everything looked the same inside except one thing. The small cooler I'd left on the floor was open. I hadn't left it like that. One of the cans of tuna was missing, and the sleeping bag I had rolled up on the bunk was unzipped and laid out like someone had climbed inside it. That was enough for me to know I wasn't alone out there. I backed out slowly, locked the door again, and stepped off the path into the brush. I circled around the cabin wide, trying not to make too much noise, checking the area behind it. Nothing. No one. But the feeling in my gut just kept getting worse. That tight, hot feeling like when you know something is really, really wrong. I had that rising in my throat, and it stayed with me all afternoon. I decided I wasn't sleeping inside that night. I packed my bag, kept the rifle close, and hiked out a half-mile to an old hunting blind I had seen on the ridge. It was falling apart, just a raised platform with half a wall, but it gave me a view of the trail and the clearing. I laid down behind it, stayed low, and waited. It got dark quick. The sun dipped behind the hills and the temperature dropped like a rock. My breath came out in clouds. I didn't dare light a fire. Around midnight, I saw movement. Down in the clearing, near the cabin. A figure. Someone walking slowly around the edge of the tree line.
No flashlight. No gear.
Just moving in circles, same slow steps. I could barely make them out, but I could tell it wasn't just some hiker or hunter. This person had no reason to be out there at that hour. They stopped by the cabin for a long time. just standing there. Then they walked off toward the same trail I had taken earlier. I stayed still all night, barely blinking. The cold felt like it was inside my bones. At first light, I made my move. I hiked back down the other side of the ridge, staying off trail the whole way. I didn't go back to the cabin. I didn't stop to pack anything. I left the cooler, the food, my gear, everything. I just kept walking until I reached the gravel road, and when I saw my truck still sitting there behind the brush, I nearly broke down. I drove straight back to Boise.
No stops.
Didn't tell anyone what happened. Not for a while. I never went back to that cabin. Marshall sold the land a year later. I don't know who owns it now, and I don't care. I didn't report anything. I didn't want to answer questions. There wasn't much to report anyway. No crime, no injuries, just a long, cold night and something out there in the woods that didn't belong. The only thing I still think about sometimes is the sleeping bag. The way it was laid out, neat like someone had used it and then tried to make it look like they hadn't. I never heard a car, never heard footsteps after that night, but someone was out there. Someone close, someone watching. They knew I was there. They probably watched me leave. I still hunt now and then, but never alone. Never again in cabins like that. Not out in places where there's no one around for miles. That trip taught me something real simple. Nature isn't the scary part. It's the people you don't see, the ones you never hear, the ones who wait, watch, and leave nothing behind but a footprint and a cold feeling you never forget. It was late October 2017 when I took time off work and drove up to a small cabin I'd rented in Northumberland, near the Scottish border. I was 33 back then, tired of the city noise in Leeds, and I just wanted a break, a bit of air, somewhere quiet. I found this remote cabin on a rental site. It wasn't fancy or modern, just a one-bedroom wooden place tucked at the edge of a forest, about a 10-minute walk from the nearest road.
No neighbors.
No phone signal. The guy who owned it left a key under a rock by the steps and said to leave it there when I left. That was it. The drive up took nearly 5 hours. I remember how gray and flat the sky looked the entire way. There wasn't much traffic, but the roads got narrower the further I went. The last part was a gravel track that cut through empty fields, some stone walls falling apart on either side, then a stretch of woods. The cabin stood just past a bend in the path, facing a dense thicket of trees that rose uphill behind it. The place looked older than in the photos. The wooden panels were weathered, stained green in parts. There was moss along the bottom, and the front steps dipped a bit when I stepped on them. Still, it was quiet. That's what I wanted. Inside, it smelled like dry wood and dust. One main room with a fireplace, an old sofa, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a kitchenette with a mini fridge and a few cabinets. The bedroom had a narrow bed with a thin mattress and a window that looked out toward the trees. There was electricity but no Wi-Fi. A water tank out back for the sink and shower. I unpacked, made a cup of tea, and sat outside as it got dark. There wasn't much to hear besides wind moving through the trees and the occasional creak from the woods. That first night, I barely slept. Not because anything happened, nothing did. I just wasn't used to the quiet. Every time the wind blew, the branches knocked against each other, or the cabin creaked, or something small moved outside, and I'd jolt awake. But by the second night, I was more relaxed. I walked a bit into the woods during the day, followed a trail that led uphill but didn't go too far. I wasn't there to hike. I just wanted to sit, read, clear my head. It was on the third night I saw her. That day had been overcast, and the woods looked darker than usual even in the afternoon. I stayed inside, writing in a notebook and staring out the front window. Around 6 p.m., I made some food, then settled into the armchair by the fireplace with a book. I didn't light a fire, just a lamp on the table behind me. It was quiet. Wind again, same as before, and I kept hearing branches tapping the roof. But then I heard something different. A thud, not loud but sharp, like something hitting the side of the cabin. I paused, waited, nothing. Then again another knock, lower this time, near the back corner. I stood up, turned off the lamp, and walked to the window by the kitchen. I couldn't see anything outside. It was pitch black, except for the faint outline of the trees against the sky. I waited again. A minute passed, 2. Then I walked over to the door, opened it slowly, and stepped out onto the small front porch. The wind had stopped. It was dead quiet now. No sound, no movement. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, scanning the trees and the edge of the clearing. I didn't have a flashlight, but the clouds had shifted a little, and a bit of moonlight lit up parts of the clearing. Then I saw her. She was standing by the edge of the woods, right at the tree line, maybe 20 feet away. I didn't see her walk up. She was just there. I could barely make out details, but it was a woman. Long gray coat, thin, hair pulled back, or maybe tied up, I couldn't tell. She wasn't facing me directly. Her body was slightly turned, but her head was pointed straight at me. She didn't move. I didn't call out. I didn't ask anything. I just stood there watching. I don't know why, but I felt frozen. Not scared yet, just still, like I wasn't sure what I was seeing. After a long few seconds, I stepped back into the cabin and shut the door. I didn't slam it. I turned the lock slowly and backed away. I turned off all the lights and sat on the floor by the fireplace. My heart was racing now. I waited, listening. For maybe an hour, I sat there in the dark. I didn't hear her leave. I didn't hear footsteps. No door. Nothing. Eventually, I stood up and looked out the window again. The clearing was empty. I told myself it was a hiker, someone passing through. But that didn't make sense. There was no path out there, and this place wasn't on any main trail. Plus, who wanders into a forest at night? The next morning, I went outside and walked to where I saw her standing. The grass was damp. I didn't see any footprints, but I wasn't expecting any. I checked around the edge of the trees and didn't find anything. No sign anyone had been there. I spent most of that day inside again. I didn't feel comfortable walking far from the cabin. I couldn't explain why, but I didn't want to be out there. Something about it felt off. That night, I kept all the lights off. I sat by the window for hours, watching. I didn't see her again. But on the 5th morning, I woke up and saw something strange. On the side of the cabin, near the back window, someone had dragged something through the dirt. 2 narrow lines, close together, starting from the woods and stopping just under the window. Like someone had walked through with a stick in each hand, or maybe something else. There were no shoe prints, just the lines. That was the day I decided to leave early. I packed everything before noon and drove back out. The whole drive home, I kept checking the rearview mirror. I didn't see anyone following me, but I still felt uneasy. I didn't stop for food, didn't take any breaks, just drove straight home and locked the door behind me when I got there. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw for a long time. It didn't seem worth it. I didn't have proof. Just a strange moment in a remote place. But that image, her standing there in the dark, silent, still staring, I couldn't shake it. Even now, sometimes when I'm walking alone at night or hear something knock against the house, I get that same feeling in my chest, like I'm being watched, like someone's just standing there waiting. A few months after that trip, I looked up the area again, just out of curiosity. I found a couple articles from a few years back about a woman who had gone missing not far from there. No body found, just vanished while out walking. The photo they used was old, blurry, taken from far away. But something about her posture in the picture made my stomach turn. I haven't gone back to Northumberland since. I never found out who she was or what she wanted, or why she was there. Maybe she was real. Maybe she was just someone lost or wandering. But the way she stood there, in the dark, not moving, not saying anything, it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt deliberate, like she'd come to see who was inside. And maybe that night she decided not to try the door. But maybe the next time she will. It was late October 2017 when I decided to take a break from the city. I had been working long hours in Dallas, stuck in the same routine, and everything was starting to blur together. I was 36 then, tired, burnt out. I had some time off saved up, and I figured a week alone in the woods might clear my head. So I rented a cabin way out in eastern Oklahoma. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small, older place tucked into a bend in the forest near Broken Bow Lake. I found it online through a private listing. The owner gave me directions and a lockbox code, and that was that. No office, no check-in desk, just me and the woods. I drove out early on a Saturday morning, took my time. By the time I reached the gravel turnoff, the sun was low and the trees had gone golden and brown. The last 5 miles were slow, just dirt, leaves, and trees pressing in on both sides. It felt like I was driving into nowhere, but I liked that. The cabin sat at the end of a long, overgrown trail that used to be a driveway. Trees shaded the roof. Moss had spread along the sides. It looked old but solid. One window was cracked in the corner, and there was a metal chimney sticking out the top, rusted brown. There wasn't another house or structure in sight. No other cars.
No neighbors.
Inside was simple. One bedroom, a small kitchen, wood stove in the middle, faded green couch, dust on the windowsills and mouse droppings under the sink, but nothing I hadn't expected. I spent the first hour unpacking and sweeping. There was no cell service.
No Wi-Fi.
Just the wind in the trees and the occasional creak of the old cabin walls. By the second day, I had adjusted to the quiet. I'd brought a pile of books, a small fishing rod, and a cooler with food and water. Every morning I walked to the lake with my thermos of coffee. There was a trail, barely a path really, that curved down through the woods to the water. About a 20-minute walk. I fished for bass and watched the wind push little ripples across the surface. At night, I used a battery lantern and a headlamp. I read and wrote in a journal. I slept early and deep. The nights were quiet except for coyotes and the cracking of branches somewhere out there in the dark. But by the third night, something felt off. I had just climbed into bed, around 9 p.m., and was listening to the fire pop in the wood stove. It had gotten cold, much colder than the first couple of nights. I remember pulling the blanket up to my chin and thinking how much darker it felt out there. Then I heard something, just a small sound, but enough to pull me up out of that relaxed state. It was a crunch, like a step, leaves underfoot, close. At first I thought maybe a deer had wandered near the cabin. I sat up, held my breath. Another crunch, then nothing, then another. Slow, one at a time. The footsteps circled. Not fast, just steady. They moved around the cabin like someone checking each wall. There were no porch lights.
No outdoor lamps.
Just the dim orange from the stove and the lantern on the nightstand. I didn't move. I just sat in the bed, frozen, trying to listen. Eventually, the sounds stopped. I stayed still for over an hour before I finally lay back down. Barely slept. In the morning, I told myself it had to be an animal. Maybe a boar or some stray dog. But part of me didn't believe that. I walked around the cabin. I checked the dirt. There were indentations near the back. Hard to tell what kind, but they looked like boot prints. Not paw prints, not hooves. I spent most of the day on edge, jumping at small sounds. I didn't go fishing. I stayed close to the cabin, chopping wood, checking my cooler. Everything still seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling someone had been out there. That night, I barricaded the front door with a heavy chair and jammed a screwdriver in the sliding window track. I slept with my boots on and my pocket knife under my pillow. It was cold again.
Nomon.
Total blackness outside. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time they didn't circle. They came from the side, slow, deliberate, and stopped just outside the bedroom window. I was lying still, listening hard, when I heard the faintest scrape against the glass. Not a knock, just something dragging slowly along it. My whole body tensed. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then there was nothing. No sound for what felt like an hour. I stayed awake until the sun came up. When it did, I went straight outside. There were marks on the window, long, pale streaks down the dust of the outside pane, like someone had drawn a finger down it. And again, in the dirt below the window, a footprint. Clearer this time. A worn boot tread. Not fresh, but not old either. I didn't pack up. I should have, I know that now. But part of me didn't want to overreact. I told myself it could have been some hiker, lost in the woods. Maybe even a prank. But it didn't feel like a prank. Felt like someone was testing the place. Watching. That fifth day, I hiked up the ridge behind the cabin to try and get a cell signal.
No luck.
Nothing but static. When I came back down in the late afternoon, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Up in the trees, maybe 200 feet from the cabin, there was a tree stump. Not unusual, but on top of it was something flat and gray. I walked closer. It was a plastic plate. On it was a dead rabbit. Head removed, guts out, cleanly. No signs of a struggle. No blood. Just a neatly arranged carcass with 2 small stones beside it. Like someone had made a display. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with the lantern on, knife in my lap. I kept the stove burning low. Didn't want to make it obvious I was up. Hours passed. Wind picked up. I thought maybe it was over, but then I heard it again. This time, not footsteps. A car. Way out here. It wasn't close, but I could hear tires on gravel from the main road above the woods. I went to the window and shut off the lantern. Nothing but darkness out there. I waited. Then I saw 2 faint headlights, far away, moving slowly through the trees, too far for a road. I hadn't seen a single vehicle for 5 days, and now someone was crawling through the forest in a car. Late at night, no lights except the faint front beams. It disappeared behind the tree line. I didn't see it again. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I packed fast, stuffed my cooler, threw everything in the car. I didn't even clean up. I just needed to get out of there. I started down the overgrown driveway, heart pounding, eyes darting through the trees. But when I reached the main road, I saw something that made me stop cold. There was a fresh tire track cutting across the dirt entrance to the cabin, like someone had parked there recently and backed out. The tread wasn't mine. It was too wide, too deep, maybe a truck, and it was fresh. You could see where the leaves had been crushed down just hours earlier. I drove straight back to Dallas without stopping. Later that night, once I had service again, I messaged the owner of the cabin. I asked if anyone else had been out there recently, maybe maintenance or neighbors nearby. No response. I checked the listing. It was gone, deleted, just vanished. I never heard back from the owner, never got a refund, never found the listing again, even though I'd saved the link. I even tried going back through my email, and the original message thread was gone too, erased like it had never existed. I don't know who was out there with me. I don't know if they were watching me the whole time or if it was just bad luck. But what I do know is that I was being stalked. Not by a ghost. Not by anything supernatural. Just a person. A real, breathing person. And the worst part? They never tried to get in. They never attacked. They just watched. Like they were waiting for something. And I'll never go back into those woods again. I was 36 when I finally took some time off work. It had been a stressful year. I'd been living alone in Tulsa since the divorce, and I think something in me needed to just get away from people. I didn't want to talk to anyone or be around anything loud. I needed quiet. So I packed up my old Ford Explorer, loaded some gear, and took my dog Clyde, a 6-year-old black lab, out to a remote cabin in the Ouachita Mountains in Arkansas. It was mid-September 2021. The heat had started to die down, and the trees were already showing the first signs of fall. The cabin was something I'd found online, buried on a page full of old hunting properties. It was owned by an old man who didn't use it anymore, and it wasn't part of any rental network. I had to wire him cash and pick the key up from a gas station locker an hour away. That should have been a red flag, but it looked quiet and far enough from the nearest town. Just what I needed. The place sat on about 20 acres of forest, near the edge of an old logging trail, and it had no running water or power. Just a propane tank and a wood stove. The drive took half a day. Once I turned off the last paved road, I followed a gravel path for almost 45 minutes. Trees pressed in close on both sides. No other cabins. No other cars. It was just me, Clyde, and the road. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the treetops, and the shadows had grown long and sharp. The place looked just like the pictures. Single story, old wood siding faded to gray, a tin roof, and a front porch that leaned slightly to one side. The steps creaked loud under my boots. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and immediately smelled the musty scent of old wood and mice. There was no sign of people, just some cobwebs in the corners and a few old chairs covered in dust. Clyde sniffed around, tail low but wagging. He always adjusted quicker than I did. I spent the rest of that evening settling in, lit some candles, fired up the old stove, and cooked a can of chili. I poured Clyde a bowl of kibble and sat next to him on the floor while he ate. Outside, the trees rustled gently, and somewhere far off, I heard what sounded like a fox. That first night, I slept surprisingly well. Clyde curled up next to my sleeping bag, and even though the mattress in the bedroom was still there, I stuck to the floor. I liked being closer to him. The second day, I took Clyde for a walk through the woods. The trail behind the cabin led up into a ridge and then down to a dry creek bed. We explored a while, saw deer tracks, and even spooked a pair of wild turkeys. I remember thinking how nice it was to be completely disconnected. No phone, no internet, no voices. Just the sounds of the forest and my dog trotting ahead, occasionally looking back to make sure I was still with him. Later that afternoon, we came across something odd. We were maybe a mile and a half from the cabin, near an overgrown section of the creek, when Clyde stopped and started growling. He rarely growled. His tail dropped, and the hair on his back stood up. I crouched next to him and looked around but didn't see anything at first. Then I noticed a strange pattern in the dirt. Several flattened areas, as if something heavy had been dragged. Clumps of disturbed leaves, shallow grooves in the soft ground. Not animal tracks, not tire treads, just wide, smooth drag marks weaving through the underbrush. They led into the trees and disappeared. I stood there a long time, staring. It didn't make sense. I called Clyde back and walked around the area, but I didn't find anything else. No bones, no trash, no signs of camping or human activity. Still, it felt wrong. The whole area was dead silent.
No birds.
No wind, like the forest was holding its breath. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an old tarp or a fallen tree had been moved recently by animals. Maybe some old hunter had pulled something through here years ago. But I didn't follow the tracks. I just turned back. Clyde kept glancing over his shoulder until we were nearly back to the cabin. That night, I couldn't relax. Every little noise outside the walls made me freeze. The wind had picked up, and the branches scraped across the roof. Clyde paced near the door for a while, sniffing under the cracks before finally settling down again. I barely slept. The next morning, I woke up to something strange. There were footprints in the dirt by the side of the cabin. Human footprints, bare feet.
No shoes. No socks.
Just a clear pattern of toes and heels in the soft mud near the fire pit I'd used the night before. They hadn't been there when I went to bed. I checked around the whole cabin. The prints circled the back wall, near the boarded-up window, then disappeared into the woods. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to overreact, but I also couldn't ignore it. I hadn't seen a single person out there, and I was miles from the nearest property line. I loaded my shotgun and kept it close. The whole day, I stayed near the cabin, gathering firewood and watching the woods. Clyde was tense too. He stayed close to me, ears twitching, nose constantly sniffing the air. A few times he ran toward the trees barking, but I couldn't see what he was barking at. There was nothing there, or at least nothing I could see. That night was worse than the one before. I kept the fire going, locked the door, and put a chair under the handle. Around 2 a.m, I heard something outside, soft steps on the porch. Clyde heard it too. He was up in an instant, growling low. I held my breath. The steps stopped just outside the door. Then, slowly, I heard a gentle knock. Not hard, not frantic, just 1, 2, 3 quiet taps. I didn't move. I sat there with the shotgun in my lap, sweating. I didn't breathe. Clyde barked, loud and sharp. The knocking stopped. A few seconds later, the steps retreated. I waited another hour before I moved. Then I opened the door, shotgun in hand, and stepped out. There was nothing, just the dark woods and the sound of leaves in the wind. But on the porch, in the dust, there were more footprints. The same bare feet. That was it for me. I packed the truck before dawn, tossed everything in the back, didn't even eat breakfast. Clyde jumped in like he knew exactly what I was doing. I didn't look back, just drove white-knuckled until I hit the highway. Later, when I got home, I reported it to the local ranger office, even though it was out of their usual range. They said they'd send someone to check it out, but I never heard anything back. I didn't really expect to. I still don't know what I saw or who. Maybe it was someone living off-grid, squatting out there in the woods. Maybe someone who didn't want me on their land, even if it technically wasn't theirs. Or maybe just some unwell person who'd been wandering the forest for years. I'll never know, but I've never gone back to that part of Arkansas. And I've never stayed in another cabin alone again. Clyde's older now. His face is turning gray around the eyes. But sometimes, on quiet nights, he still gets up and stares at the door like he's waiting for something. Or someone. I get it. I do the same. I hadn't been back to the cabin since the fall of 2018. That was the year I finally left Wayne for good. He bought that place back in 2005, deep in the woods of northern Minnesota, near a place called Kabetogama. It was an hour from anything, a tight little wooden thing with no running water, an old iron stove, and a deck that overlooked a shallow, swampy ravine filled with birch and deadfall. I hated that cabin, but Wayne loved it, said it was his place to clear his head, his man space. I always thought it was where he went to get away from me, from our problems, maybe even to do things I never wanted to know about. We divorced in 2019. After everything, his silence, his drinking, the mood swings, I didn't feel much when he died last year. Apparently, it was a heart attack while he was hauling firewood from a pile behind the cabin. Found him laying next to the stacked birch, dead in the snow, alone. That image didn't scare me. It made sense. Wayne always wanted to be alone. The cabin passed to me. I didn't want it, but I also didn't want to deal with lawyers or county clerks, so I just let it sit. But this year, something made me go back. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe I just wanted to see if it really was as bad as I remembered. Either way, in late October, I packed up a few days' worth of clothes, some food, a pistol Wayne had left behind in a lockbox, and drove up from Rochester. It was a quiet Friday morning. Sky was gray, light drizzle coming down. The kind that doesn't soak you but seeps into everything over time. It was about a 5-hour drive. The farther north I went, the fewer cars I saw. By the time I hit the last 20 miles, it felt like I was the only one on the road. There were long stretches where the trees leaned in close to the road, and fog moved low between them like it had nowhere else to be. When I finally pulled up to the turnoff for the cabin, I almost missed it. The wooden post with the carved numbers had rotted and slumped sideways, and the dirt trail that led to the cabin was nearly grown over with grass, wet leaves, and sticks. The wheels of my SUV crunched as I drove slowly down that narrow path, ducking branches and dodging deep ruts that looked like they'd filled with runoff from months of rain. When the cabin came into view, something in my chest tightened. It looked the same but more tired. The wood siding had gone gray, almost silver, and the roof was heavy with damp pine needles. The chimney leaned slightly, and one shutter had fallen off completely and lay half-buried in wet leaves. The front porch steps creaked under my weight when I got out. I unlocked the front door using the old key Wayne had left in an envelope in his will. The metal was cold in my hand. Inside, it smelled like mold, old wood, and something sour. I stood for a moment and let my eyes adjust. It was dim, with dust motes floating in the gray light that slipped through the window. The furniture was still there. The same sagging couch, the same table with uneven legs, the same oil lamp on the shelf. The walls had warped a little, and the place felt slightly tilted. I spent the next few hours cleaning up, wiped down the windows, brushed cobwebs out of the corners, swept dust off the shelves, and used a pack of Lysol wipes on every surface. I checked the pantry. Some old cans, mouse droppings, a box of crackers so old it looked fossilized. I tossed everything out and unpacked my cooler and gear. As the sun set, I got a fire going in the stove. I had brought dry logs from home and stacked them near the iron belly of the thing. The metal creaked and ticked as it heated up, and soon the place was warm enough to take off my coat. I sat on the couch and listened to the fire pop. Outside, the wind picked up and rustled the trees. Rain started again, light at first, then steady. The forest turned to a gray blur beyond the window. I was there to sort through Wayne's things, maybe see what I could keep, what I could donate, and what I needed to burn. I didn't think I'd find much, but there were still some of his old boxes in the back room. I remembered them being filled with junk. Old tools, faded notebooks, fishing lures, and odds and ends he never let me touch. I waited until the next morning to go through them. The rain hadn't let up, and the whole forest seemed soaked and muffled. The back room was colder than the rest of the cabin. I opened the door and was hit with a wall of stale air. The window back there had cracked from corner to corner, and the wind had blown in some leaves and water stains. One of the boxes had tipped over, spilling a bunch of papers across the floor. I crouched and started collecting them. Most of it was garbage. Scribbled notes, receipts from gas stations, pages ripped out of magazines. But some of the papers were weird. Pages of what looked like hand-drawn maps, circles and arrows in red pen. One page had just the same sentence repeated over and over again. Asterisk, don't go near the line. Asterisk, it didn't mean anything to me. Just Wayne being Wayne. He had always had a paranoid streak. Thought people were watching him. Sometimes he'd talk about how the neighbors were spying, even though there weren't any neighbors for miles. But as I moved more boxes, I noticed something odd. There was a part of the floor that looked different, like the boards had been pulled up and put back down. The nails were newer. The color didn't quite match. I stood there for a while, then fetched a crowbar from the shelf. I pried the boards up slowly. Underneath was a shallow space, maybe 2 feet deep. Inside were 3 things: an empty duffel bag with a ripped strap, a shovel with dried mud on it, and a pair of work gloves soaked in something dark. They were stiff, smelled metallic. I dropped them fast and sat back, heart pounding. I don't know why, but the first thing I thought was someone else was here. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going and sat in the chair facing the door, the pistol on my lap. Every time the wind groaned, I flinched. At one point, I was sure I saw movement in the tree line outside. But when I looked again, there was nothing. The next morning, I decided to check the back of the property. There was an old trail that led down past the ravine and into a narrow clearing where Wayne had once planned to build a shed. I put on boots and a coat, grabbed the pistol, and headed out. It was muddy and cold, but I needed to see. Something was pulling at me. Halfway down the slope, I found it fresh earth, a rectangular patch of dirt that had been turned up recently. The shovel marks were clean, not washed out like they would be after months of rain and snow. The ground was still soft. My heart thudded as I stepped closer. Near the edge of the clearing, half buried in a tangle of weeds, was a rolled tarp. It was stained, something wrapped up inside it. I didn't open it, couldn't. I backed away slowly, turned, and climbed back up the hill. I left the cabin that night, didn't even clean up. I drove 5 hours in silence, headlights cutting through the black. I didn't stop, didn't eat, didn't breathe easy until I saw the lights of a gas station near Brainerd. When I got home, I called the sheriff's office and told them everything. I didn't use my name at first, just said I'd inherited a property and found something strange. I don't know what they found after they went out there. They called me a few days later and asked if I'd ever heard of a man named Derek Voss. I hadn't. They said he'd been missing since 2021. Last seen working as a part-time contractor up near Kabetogama. I told them I didn't know anything, and that was the truth. They're still investigating, far as I know. I never went back. I signed the paperwork to have the cabin demolished. The land's still mine, but I don't want it. I don't want to think about what Wayne might have done. I don't want to know who else he might have been in those last few years, alone up there in that cold little place. I thought I knew him, but now I think I just knew the part he showed me. The rest was buried, literally, and I was lucky to walk away from it. It was the fall of 2016 when I finally decided to use the old cabin my uncle left me after he passed away. The place had been sitting empty for nearly 12 years, tucked away deep in the mountains of northern Idaho, about 2 hours from the nearest town, Wallace. I was 38 back then and working construction jobs that came and went, so I had enough time off in between to finally get out there, clean the place up, and maybe stay a few days to clear my head. The drive-in was rough. The last 25 miles weren't paved, just a winding gravel road through thick woods with no signs, no other cars, and barely any signal on my phone. The deeper I got, the more the trees closed in, and the lights started to dim even though it was only around 3 p.m. I had my old border collie, Rex, in the passenger seat. He was getting older, but still alert, always sitting up and sniffing the air whenever the truck slowed down. The cabin sat in a small clearing about 100 yards from a shallow creek. It was made of old pine logs, weather-beaten and sun-bleached, with a rusted tin roof that clattered every time the wind picked up. There was a small tool shed in the back, mostly rotted, and a water pump that barely worked anymore. No power lines, no plumbing, just the basics, with stove, lanterns, a hand-built cot, and a beat-up table with 2 chairs. First thing I did was air the place out. The smell of mildew, mice droppings, and dry rot hit me the second I pried the front door open. I kept it propped with a log while I swept out dead leaves and broken glass from a window that had cracked sometime over the years. I found a couple of rats' nests in the corners and a squirrel carcass under the cot. Took me the rest of the day to make it livable. Rex kept pacing around the cabin while I worked, sniffing at the floor and growling low at one of the walls, which didn't make me feel great. That night, it got cold fast. I lit the stove and cracked open a can of beans I'd brought along, trying not to think too much about how dark it was outside. There was no moon, just solid black past the treeline. Rex wouldn't settle down. He kept sitting by the door, staring at it, ears forward, tail stiff. I figured it was just the sounds of the woods. The wind, branches creaking, maybe a deer or something moving around out there. I went to sleep early, wrapped in my sleeping bag on the cot with Rex curled up on the floor nearby. I don't think I slept more than 2 or 3 hours. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something. Not just trees or critters, but actual footsteps outside. Slow, crunching on the leaves, then stopping, then starting again. I kept telling myself it was animals, but these sounded too heavy, too measured. I stayed in my bag, staring at the ceiling, listening, while Rex let out low, steady growls without moving. Next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin with my rifle. I didn't see tracks, but the ground was mostly hard-packed dirt and pine needles, which don't hold prints too well. I told myself I was being paranoid. I'd been in the woods before, camped, hunted, done logging work. But something about this spot, it was quiet in a bad way. The kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. Even the birds weren't around. I spent the day cutting some wood, trying to get the pump working better, and fixing the window with a plastic tarp. I didn't plan on staying more than a few days anyway, just long enough to fix the place up enough to come back later with some friends. By evening, I cooked a little stew over the fire and took Rex down to the creek to let him drink. That's when I noticed it. Something had been moved. About 20 feet from the cabin, in the clearing just past the tool shed, there was a pile of rocks stacked about waist high. Neatly, too neat to be an accident. I hadn't seen it the day before, and I sure didn't build it. At first, I thought maybe it had always been there and I just missed it, but Rex wouldn't go near it. He stopped about 10 feet from it, hackles up, tail tucked between his legs. I checked it out. It wasn't just random rocks. There were small bones mixed in. Not human, probably rabbit or squirrel, but they'd been arranged like someone took their time doing it. I kicked it apart, feeling uneasy. I didn't say anything, just dragged Rex back inside and barred the door with a long piece of wood I wedged under the handle. That night, the footsteps came back, but this time they didn't stop at one spot. They circled the cabin, slow, dragging steps all the way around the walls. I sat up with my rifle across my lap, every muscle tight. I didn't turn on the lantern. I didn't want whoever or whatever was out there to see me. Rex stood the whole time, stiff and silent, facing the door. Every few minutes, I'd hear something scrape the wood, light like fingernails, then silence, then the crunch of leaves again.
I stayed up till sunrise.
When the light finally came, I crept outside. No prints again, no broken branches, but out past the clearing, near where the pile of rocks had been, I found something that made my blood run cold. There was a piece of cloth nailed to a tree, old, sun-bleached denim, torn and soaked in something dark. Below it, a crude wooden cross had been stabbed into the ground, almost like a warning or some kind of twisted ritual. I took it down and threw it in the creek. That was the last straw. I packed my things fast, tossed everything in the truck, didn't even bother folding the sleeping bag. I didn't eat, didn't clean up. Rex jumped in without hesitation, tail down, ears back. We drove fast, faster than I should have on that rough gravel road, with every bump jarring the truck and dust filling the air behind us. I kept checking the rear view, half expecting to see someone standing in the middle of the road, but it stayed empty. I didn't stop until I hit the first paved stretch and got 2 bars on my phone. I pulled over and called my cousin, told him something was off about the cabin and I wasn't going back anytime soon. I didn't go into detail. I knew how it would sound. A few months later, I heard from a local hunter who said he tried to hike out that way but stopped short. Said he saw strange things, carvings on trees, little stick figures hanging from the branches, and piles of bones that looked like they'd been arranged by hand. He said it felt wrong, like someone was watching. I never went back, not once. That cabin still sits out there in the trees, falling apart piece by piece. But I never sold it. I kept the land. Maybe I hold on to it because it reminds me there are still places out there where people don't go. Not because they can't, but because they shouldn't. Places that don't want you there, that never wanted you there. And I believe that cabin is one of them. It was the fall of 2019 when I decided to take a break from city life. I had been living in Chicago for over 8 years and everything just felt too loud and crowded. I worked in construction, mostly drywall and framing, and though I enjoyed the work, I was burnt out. My ex-girlfriend had moved out 3 months before, and ever since then, my apartment felt colder and smaller. I started thinking about getting away for a while, somewhere quiet. No internet.
No noise.
Just trees, air, and time to think. A guy I knew from work, David, had inherited a small wooden cabin from his uncle years ago, tucked away in the southern part of Kentucky, near a town called Corbin. He only used it once or twice during hunting season and told me if I wanted to use it for a week or two, I could. I didn't even hesitate. I packed up some tools, canned food, a cooler with water and meat, and filled up my truck. I even brought an old camping mattress and my hunting knife just in case. The cabin was about 4 miles off the main road, down a barely maintained dirt path that winded through a patch of thick woods and shallow hills. The GPS gave out halfway through, but David had drawn me a map. That map was the only reason I found the place. The last half mile was nothing more than ruts in the grass, with tree limbs hanging low enough to scrape the hood of my truck. When I finally saw the roof of the place through the branches, I stopped for a moment just to take it in. It was small, maybe 20 by 30 feet, with faded green siding, a tin roof, and a porch that looked like it could collapse under a heavy step. A stack of chopped firewood leaned against one side, and there was an old metal drum full of ashes in front of the door. I remember the air smelled like damp earth and pine needles. Everything was quiet, not peaceful quiet, more like the kind of quiet that makes you notice your own breathing. I unpacked and got settled. The inside was about as basic as it gets. Just a single room with a wood stove, a small table, one broken down recliner, and a twin mattress on a wooden frame. No plumbing, no power, just an outhouse about 30 yards out the back, half hidden in a clump of trees. I didn't mind. I wasn't there for comfort. I wanted stillness. That first night, I sat on the porch with a can of chili and listened to nothing. No cars, no people, just the wind moving through the leaves. On the second day, I hiked around the woods with a small pack and my knife on my belt. I marked trees with bits of orange tape to avoid getting turned around, though the land felt familiar even though I'd never been there before. I saw deer tracks, squirrel nests, even an old rusted trap nailed to a log, probably from years back. It felt untouched. Around day 3, I started noticing small things. Nothing big at first, just signs that someone or something had been near the cabin. A piece of bark peeled off a tree in a weird pattern. Footprints in the dirt that didn't match mine. They were a little too long, a little too narrow, and bare. Not boots, not shoes, just bare feet. I tried to tell myself it was old. Maybe someone came through months ago, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't old. The edges of the prints still had shape to them. No leaves or dust blown in. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept waking up thinking I heard something walking outside. A soft crunch, then silence. I didn't go out to check. I didn't want to see anything. On the 5th day, I decided to hike further out, just to clear my head. I left early and packed a sandwich, some jerky, water, and my compass. I followed the small stream that ran behind the cabin and moved northeast, marking trees as I went. After maybe an hour of walking, I found a dead raccoon lying belly up, stiff and bloated. The weird thing was, its front legs were tied together with what looked like a piece of old shirt fabric, dirty and frayed. I stood there staring at it for a long time, not sure what kind of person does that to an animal and then just leaves it like that. I kept going. About another mile in, I found a tree stump that had been hollowed out in the middle. Inside it was a glass jar filled with something dark, maybe berries or meat, but it was sealed with wax and twine. There were weird burn marks all around the base of the stump, like someone had lit a fire and let it burn low and slow. I didn't touch any of it. I turned back. That night, I locked the cabin door and wedged a chair under the handle. I put my knife right next to the mattress and laid awake until sometime after 2 in the morning. Just after I finally started drifting off, I heard something bump against the wall outside. Just once, then silence. The next morning, I found muddy handprints on the back wall of the cabin. Not just 1 or 2. There were at least 7 or 8 all around the lower part of the wall, like someone had been crouching and feeling along the boards. They were narrow, long fingers and dirty. I felt sick looking at them. My first thought was to leave, but something in me said no. I didn't want to run. I didn't want to leave scared. I told myself I'd stay 2 more nights, then go. That afternoon, I carried some firewood in from the pile, and when I picked up the last few logs, I found a bundle of feathers tied together with a strip of leather tucked between the stacked pieces. I didn't put it there. I hadn't seen it the day before. It looked like chicken feathers, but they were tied so tight the ends had snapped off. I tossed it in the fire. Maybe that was a mistake. That night was the worst. I barely slept. Around midnight, I heard something moving behind the cabin. Footsteps in the dry leaves, slow and steady. Then I heard a low knocking sound, 3 soft taps against the back wall. I laid still, barely breathing. Then nothing. After 10 minutes, I thought maybe it was over. I got up and peeked through the front window, my knife in hand. About 20 feet out, just on the edge of where the trees began, I saw a shape. Person, maybe male, crouched down low, just watching. I couldn't see a face, just the outline, but I knew it wasn't an animal. He didn't move. I didn't move. We just stayed like that for what felt like forever. I finally backed away and sat down on the floor, heart thudding. I stayed up the rest of the night with my back to the wall. As soon as the sun came up, I packed everything in a rush and left. I didn't eat, didn't check around the cabin. I just shoved my gear into the truck and drove. I didn't even look in the rearview mirror until I hit the main road. Back in Chicago, I didn't tell anyone about it. When people asked if I had a good break, I just nodded and said it was peaceful. But sometimes I wake up thinking I hear those same 3 knocks against the wall. Sometimes I wonder if whoever was out there in those woods lives there full time. Maybe I just wandered into someone else's territory. Maybe I was never supposed to be there in the first place. I never went back. And I never asked David if his uncle was into anything strange. But I did one thing when I got home. I took that map and burned it in my bathtub. I didn't want to risk finding that place again. And I sure as hell didn't want it finding me. It was September 2021 when I decided to take a break from everything and spend some time alone in the mountains of Western North Carolina. I was 32 back then, living in Charlotte, burned out from my job in construction and tired of city noise. I didn't tell many people where I was going, just needed space. I found a patch of private land online, several acres of wooded hillside about 2 hours from town, and bought it. It had no structures, no trails, nothing but trees and wet earth. My plan was simple: build a small off-grid cabin by hand, take it slow, and live off what I could manage. The drive up was peaceful. I left early in the morning, and by the time I pulled off the gravel road and onto the muddy clearing I'd marked on the map, the sky was already heavy with clouds. The truck struggled a little on the last incline. Rain had fallen the night before, and the forest floor was slick. I stepped out and stood still for a few minutes, just listening. The woods were quiet except for a few birds and the sound of wind running through wet leaves. No traffic.
No sirens. No voices.
Felt like I'd stepped out of time. I brought just enough to get started. A tent, hand tools, a chainsaw, camping gear, and a few days' worth of food and water. I knew I'd need to make trips back to town for supplies, but for now I just wanted to work with what I had. I picked a flat patch near the edge of a slope where the trees thinned out a bit, giving me a view through the trunks down to a dry creek bed. The ground was damp but firm. I spent the first 2 days clearing brush, cutting saplings, and laying down rough footing for what would become the frame of the cabin. I used local timber where I could, chopping and trimming by hand. The work was slow but good, gave my mind something to focus on. By the third evening, clouds began rolling in again, thicker and darker than before. The air felt tight, and the forest grew still in a way that made the back of my neck itch. I'd pitched my tent beside a pile of cut logs, not far from where I planned to build the cabin's front wall. The wind picked up late in the day, and I could smell rain in it. I figured I'd keep working until dark and sleep through the storm if it got bad. I didn't feel like driving back to town just for weather. That night, the rain came harder than I expected. I was lying inside the tent, wrapped in my sleeping bag, when it started slow drops at first, tapping on the nylon like fingers, then a steady roar that drowned out everything else. The sound of rain on a tent is usually calming, but this wasn't that. This was loud. The trees swayed and creaked overhead, branches cracked in the wind, and now and then I'd hear something thump against the forest floor in the distance. I lay there in the dark, eyes open, feeling every little bump in the ground beneath me. Around midnight, I heard movement outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe a tree groaning. But then I heard steps, definite heavy steps, not fast, not scattered, slow and even. I froze. My first thought was that it might be a black bear. That wasn't uncommon out here, especially with food around. I reached for the flashlight beside my sleeping bag and didn't turn it on yet. I just held it tight and waited. The steps moved past the tent, then paused. I couldn't see anything through the thin wall of nylon, but I could feel it out there, whoever or whatever it was, just standing a few feet away. The seconds dragged on. I didn't breathe. Rain hammered the tent. Wind pushed it in and out, but nothing moved near me. Then the steps started again, this time heading toward the area where my tools and logs were. Still slow, still controlled. I wanted to unzip the tent and peek out, but I couldn't make myself do it. Something about the way it moved wasn't right. It wasn't an animal. I've spent enough time in the woods to know the difference between wildlife and a person trying not to be noticed. I stayed still until the steps faded. I don't remember falling asleep, but at some point I must have. When I opened my eyes again, it was morning. The rain had stopped, and fog drifted between the trees. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, shivering a little from the cold air. The forest smelled like wet earth and pine. I checked my gear first, chainsaw, axe, hammer, all still there. Nothing missing, but something felt off. Some of the logs I had stacked were knocked over, not like they'd fallen naturally, but like someone had tried to move them and gave up halfway. I looked around for prints in the mud, but the rain had washed away everything. I told myself it was just the storm, maybe wind, maybe an animal did get curious and nudge the pile. I tried not to think about the footsteps. I forced myself back into routine. That whole day I worked like nothing happened, raising the side beams, measuring, sawing, setting joints. But I kept glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, kept listening for any noise that didn't belong. The forest was quiet again, too quiet sometimes.
No birds, no squirrels.
Just the sound of trees breathing in the wind. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay inside the tent with the flashlight in one hand and a hatchet in the other, staring up at the dark. The rain came back around midnight, lighter this time. I thought I'd be okay. But then, again, I heard the steps. This time, I was sure they were closer. Not just wandering around the edge of the site, but near my tent, circling. I could feel it through the ground, soft thuds in the wet soil. I sat up, heart racing. I clicked the flashlight on and held it against the side of the tent. Shadows flickered outside, branches mostly. But once, for just a second, I saw something pass by. A shape, tall, upright. That was it. I waited for morning, packed my things fast, and left the site before the sun had fully come up. I drove all the way back to Charlotte that same day. I didn't tell anyone what happened, not even my brother when he asked how the trip went. I said the weather was bad and left it at that. A few weeks later, I drove back up with a friend. I didn't tell him what I saw or heard. I just said I wanted help finishing the cabin. We spent the weekend working, got the roof frame up, finished part of the back wall. We didn't hear anything weird, and nothing seemed out of place. But on our last morning there, we found something that made my skin crawl. Right behind the cabin, near the tree line, was a little pile of rocks. I hadn't seen it before, and it wasn't natural. The rocks were small, smooth, stacked in a little cone shape, maybe 2 feet high. At the top was a broken piece of wood. Looked like one of my stakes, the kind I used to mark corners. It had been snapped in half and shoved into the center of the pile like a flag. My friend thought it was nothing. Maybe some kid messing around, he said. But there weren't any other cabins for miles.
No trails.
No tire tracks. Just us. We left it alone and finished what we could. But I never went back after that. I sold the land a few months later to a guy in Asheville who wanted hunting property. I never told him about the steps in the rain, or the figure, or the little rock pile in the woods. Sometimes I still think about it, though, especially when it storms at night. I still build things. I still like the woods. But I don't camp alone anymore, and I never go back to places I've walked away from. Some things aren't meant to be finished. That cabin's frame is probably still standing up there, half-rotted and overgrown, just waiting for someone else to come along and try again. I hope they're not alone when they do. It was October 2019 when I decided to take some time off from work and head out to a cabin that belonged to a friend of my uncle's. I had never met the guy, but apparently he'd moved to Florida years ago and hadn't visited the cabin since. It was in western North Carolina, up in the edge of the Nantahala forest. My uncle said the place was still standing and had running water and power. That's all I needed to hear. I was 32 at the time, living alone in Raleigh, just tired of the constant noise, the office, the daily grind. I wanted quiet. I wanted some time to think. I drove out there in my old Ford Escape. The GPS signal got spotty the deeper I went into the hills, but I had printed directions. The last stretch was a narrow dirt road that wound through trees that leaned too close to the sides of the vehicle. I kept driving, figuring I'd gone too far a few times, but eventually I saw the old gate, a bent metal thing with rust around the hinges. The gate was unlocked and hanging open slightly. I pulled in slowly. There were no other houses around, no cell signal, just quiet woods and fallen leaves. The cabin was set back about 100 yards from the road, tucked into a low hill, half covered in red and brown leaves. It was small, one-floor, wooden siding, and a pitched roof with a little chimney. A single front porch light was still attached, though I doubted it worked. I parked off to the side, got out, stretched, and just stood there for a while. There was something about the stillness that felt different. Not bad exactly, but not peaceful either. I just chalked it up to being far from civilization. I unlocked the front door with the key my uncle gave me, and it opened with a little resistance, like it hadn't been used in a while. Inside was basic wood floors, a small table, a stove that ran on propane, a little bathroom, and a cot in the corner. There were old blankets folded on top, dusty but dry. The windows had curtains, and the place smelled like dust and pine. I unpacked my cooler and some canned food, set up my stuff, and by the time the sun dipped behind the trees, I lit the old propane lantern I found on a shelf and got ready for bed. The first night was fine. It got cold quickly, and I had to bundle up in both blankets to keep warm. I woke up once or twice from the sound of branches knocking against the window, but nothing unusual. It was the kind of quiet where you can hear your heartbeat if you lay still long enough. The second day, I spent hiking the woods around the property. There were no trails, just leaves and thick trees. I found an old shed deeper in the woods, maybe 200 yards behind the cabin. It was half collapsed, and inside there were broken tools, rotted wood, and something that looked like a rusted-out freezer. I didn't open it. The air inside that shed felt stale in a way I didn't like. I backed out and left it alone. That night, just before dark, I heard something outside while I was sitting on the porch drinking some instant coffee. It sounded like crunching leaves, but heavier, more deliberate. I figured it was a deer or maybe a black bear passing through. I stood still and listened. The sound stopped when I stood. I waited, but nothing else moved. After a while, I went back inside and locked the door. Around 1 a.m., I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. Then I realized I was listening to footsteps outside. Slow, steady steps on dry leaves. I sat up, heart pounding. The cabin didn't have any outside lights, and it was pitch black. I crawled quietly over to the window and pulled the curtain back just a crack. There was nothing there, just darkness and the faint outline of trees. But the footsteps kept going. They circled the cabin, slow and deliberate. Then they stopped near the back. I didn't move. I just sat there for at least 20 minutes, waiting, not even breathing too loud. Eventually, I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was the sun leaking through the curtains. I stepped outside that morning and walked around the cabin. There were faint tracks in the leaves, human-shaped, like boots. They weren't mine. I hadn't gone around the back at all. The prints came from the trees and circled the cabin, just like I thought. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't feel right wandering off again. I kept glancing at the woods, expecting to see someone just standing there, watching, but there was never anyone. Around 3 p.m., I heard a loud crack from deep in the trees behind the cabin. Not a branch falling, more like something snapping under weight. I didn't check it out. That evening, I brought a flashlight and sat with my back against the front wall of the cabin so I could see both the door and part of the woods. It got cold again, and around 9:30 I finally went inside and bolted the door. I placed a chair under the knob and dragged a small shelf in front of it just in case. I left the lantern off and sat in the dark with my flashlight off, just waiting. I didn't know what for. Then just past midnight, I heard it again. Those same footsteps. This time slower, more cautious. I could tell they were trying to be quiet. I stood still near the window, listening. The steps stopped at the front of the cabin. Then silence. Not a single sound. Suddenly, the doorknob turned. Slowly. Twisted back and forth. Then shook a little harder. The chair held. I stood there frozen with my flashlight in hand, barely breathing. After a few minutes, it stopped. The footsteps moved away, but I didn't sleep that night. When morning came, I packed everything. I didn't eat, didn't clean up, just stuffed it all into my bag, grabbed my keys, and got in the car. As I backed out, I glanced at the tree line, and that's when I saw him. A man, maybe in his 50s or 60s, was standing between two trees, half hidden in shadow. He had on dark clothes, a hat pulled low. I couldn't make out his face. He didn't move, just watched. I drove out of there faster than I should have on that narrow road. My hands didn't stop shaking until I got to the next town over. I pulled into a gas station, sat in the car, and tried to calm down. I didn't report anything. What would I even say? Back in Raleigh, I told my uncle I left early because the place was colder than I expected. I never mentioned the man. I never asked who used to live out there or if anyone else knew about the cabin. I still think about that guy. I think he'd been using the cabin without anyone knowing. Maybe he thought it was abandoned. Maybe he lived out in those woods, surviving off what he could find. Or maybe he just didn't want anyone near what he thought was his. All I know is, if I hadn't locked the door or stayed up that night, something worse might have happened. Something real. I've never gone back, and I won't. It was the fall of 2014 when I decided to head out to a cabin in northern Arizona, near a remote patch of forest outside a small town called Sanders. I had been working nonstop for months at my job as a land surveyor in Tucson, and the pressure had gotten to me. My therapist, who I'd been seeing since early spring after a panic episode on a highway job, told me I needed to step away from everything for a while. He recommended I go somewhere quiet, off-grid, alone, without phone service, where I could breathe without anyone needing something from me. I didn't want to go too far north into the snow or high into the mountains, so I picked a spot close to the New Mexico border where the weather stayed dry but cooler in the fall. My cousin Andrew, who worked in land management up there, had mentioned an old Forest Service cabin that used to be used in the 80s and 90s. He said no one checked it anymore, but it was still standing and had a stove, water catchment barrel, and even an outhouse. All you needed was a key to the chained road gate, and he mailed that to me in an envelope with no note, just the key. I took a week off and packed the back of my 2004 Ford Ranger with supplies. Propane, a small generator, some canned food, dry snacks, 2 gallons of water, a .22 rifle, batteries, and a tarp. I brought my dog too, a 6-year-old mutt named Jasper. He had a thick black coat and those eyes that seemed to understand more than they should. The road to the cabin wasn't marked. I had to follow an old logging road for over 20 miles, bumping and shaking the entire way. It took me nearly 3 hours to reach it from the highway. There was no cell signal the moment I turned off the main road, and that suited me fine. I was looking forward to not being reachable. The cabin sat on a slightly raised ridge facing a tree-covered valley. Most of the trees were thin, dusty junipers with scattered tall pines that rose above the rest. From the front porch, I could see almost a mile across the forest. There was no sign of human activity anywhere. No cabins nearby. No old fences. Not even a trailhead. Inside, it smelled like wood and age. The place was about 20 by 25 feet, with a single room and a wood stove in the corner. The cot still had a foam mattress on it, which I covered with my sleeping bag. The windows were dusty but unbroken, and a few pieces of furniture. A table, 2 chairs, and a metal storage locker were still there. Mice had gotten in at some point, but the droppings were old. The first 2 days were calm. I hiked a little in the morning, cooked simple meals, read a paperback I'd brought, and listened to the wind through the trees. The silence was heavier out there, the kind you don't notice until you've been sitting in it a while. No car sounds.
No planes.
Just the occasional rustle of leaves or the creak of an old wall beam expanding in the afternoon heat. Jasper didn't bark once those first 2 days. He stayed close, even when I walked the perimeter of the clearing. On the 3rd night, things changed. That evening, just after sundown, I heard something far off in the trees. It wasn't an animal sound I recognized. It was slow, like a shuffle or a scrape, maybe 50 yards out. Jasper froze near the doorway and wouldn't step outside, even though I had just opened the door to let him do his business. I walked out onto the porch with a flashlight and swept the beam slowly along the tree line. Nothing moved. No eyes reflected back at me. I stood there for a few minutes listening, but the sound didn't come again. Jasper still wouldn't come out, so I let him stay inside. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of crunching outside. It was faint, like something stepping carefully over dry needles. I sat up in my sleeping bag and stayed still. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers, and the room was dim. Jasper was awake too, staring at the window. His ears were up. He growled low and deep. I picked up my rifle and stood by the window. I didn't turn on a light. I didn't want to give away my position. I listened for almost 5 minutes. The crunching had stopped. Then came the whistle. It was soft, broken, and wrong, like someone trying to copy a bird call but doing it badly. 3 notes, spaced out. Then silence again. My mouth went dry. I stayed by the window until sunrise, rifle in hand, barely blinking. Jasper didn't sleep either. Every time I moved, he followed with his eyes. The next morning, I walked the tree line with the rifle slung over my shoulder. I didn't find any footprints, no droppings, nothing out of place. But I noticed something I hadn't before. A deer skull nailed to a tree behind the cabin. It had moss growing on it, so it had to have been there a long time, but I hadn't seen it the day I arrived. It wasn't fresh. It just felt off. I spent the rest of the day reinforcing the cabin. I closed the shutters, blocked the front steps with logs, and kept the fire small so it wouldn't glow too bright at night. I should have left right then, but part of me didn't want to look weak, even to myself. That night, the sound came back. This time it was footsteps, closer, maybe 20 feet away. Not running or walking, just a slow, heavy shifting. Then the whistle again. It wasn't a bird. I knew that now. It was a person, or at least someone trying to sound like a bird. I didn't move. I kept the rifle pointed at the door. Jasper growled louder this time. His back was bristled, and his lips pulled back until I could see his gums. Then something tapped on the side of the cabin. Not hard, just once, then twice more, slow, spaced out. I didn't sleep that night either. I kept thinking of the rumors people tossed around in Arizona and New Mexico. Stories about people in the woods pretending to be animals, about strange sounds and worse things. They called them skinwalkers. I never believed in that stuff. I still don't. But whoever was out there knew those stories and wanted me to think about them. In the morning, I walked around the cabin and found a piece of barbed wire hanging from a branch at chest height. It hadn't been there before. Just one loop of old rusted wire, dangling from a thin pine. My chest felt tight. I packed everything that morning. I strapped everything back into the truck. I didn't clean the cabin or take the trash. I just locked the door and threw the key into the woods. Before I left, I noticed Jasper sniffing one of the logs near the porch, where the tapping had come from. There was a smudge on it, a handprint in dirt or ash. I drove fast down the logging road. I hit a rock at one point and thought I'd blown a tire, but I didn't stop. I didn't breathe right until I hit pavement and saw the first ranch fence. I never went back. To this day, I don't know who was out there. Maybe it was just a hunter trying to scare me off. Maybe someone who lived in the woods and didn't like company. Or maybe it was someone messed up in the head, playing games with whoever wandered too far into the trees. But it wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a demon. It was a real person, and that's what makes it worse. It was late October 2017 when I decided to take a break from the city and head out to my uncle's old property in Nebraska. He'd passed away 2 years earlier and left behind a small, rundown farm that nobody really wanted to deal with. It wasn't big enough to profit from, and too remote for anyone to live there comfortably. But after a few months of stress at my job in Denver, I just wanted silence. No traffic, no screens, no people. I was 31 then. I didn't grow up around farms, but I wasn't totally useless. I could fix simple things, cook, and I wasn't afraid of a little dirt. The idea of sitting in an old wooden cabin on the edge of a cornfield for a few days felt peaceful. I packed a week's worth of canned food, dry goods, and tools, filled my truck with gas, and drove out early one morning. The drive took about 8 hours. By the time I reached the farm, the sun was already dipping low behind the trees. The cabin stood alone near the treeline, with the barn about 50 yards to the east and 2 collapsed sheds farther back. The cornfield was dead and dry, the stalks brittle and gray, never harvested since my uncle died. Everything around looked like it had been forgotten. Even the mailbox leaned crooked on its post like it had given up years ago. The cabin was just as I remembered from childhood visits. Plain wood, 1 story, small front porch, single chimney. Inside, it smelled like dust and dry wood. There was an old cast iron stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a cot with a thin mattress. No plumbing, no electricity, just a hand pump out back and an outhouse about 20 steps into the trees. I unpacked my stuff and settled in. It was quiet, almost too quiet. That first night, the wind rattled the old shutters. I laid in bed with my coat on, blanket pulled up to my nose. The stars outside were sharp and cold. At some point, I heard something thud outside. Maybe a branch falling, I told myself. I wasn't nervous yet, just not used to the sounds of real silence. But something about the darkness felt heavier than usual. I didn't sleep much. The next day, I worked around the cabin. I cleared out spiderwebs, swept the floor, cut some firewood from a dead tree near the field. There were animal tracks all around, raccoons, maybe a coyote. Nothing unusual. I made a small fire in the stove that night and read from a book I brought, trying to settle in. But the second night, things felt different. I was almost asleep when I heard it again. A sound outside. Not a thud this time. It was more like a slow, crunching step. Dry grass being walked on. Then a pause. Then another step. I froze. My heartbeat was loud in my ears. I didn't want to move, didn't want to make a sound. I listened for what felt like 10 minutes and then it stopped. Nothing. I stayed like that until the sun came up through the cracks in the boards. When I stepped outside the next morning, I walked around the cabin, looking for tracks. At first, I didn't see anything. But then I noticed a spot in the grass by the corner where the weeds were flattened down. Could have been from a deer or something, but it was just one spot. No trail leading in or out. I told myself maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I had heard an animal walking through and it was gone now. I stayed busy that day. Went to the barn to check it out. The roof was sagging badly and the doors were warped, but I managed to pull one open. Inside was a tractor, rusted and useless, and a bunch of old tools hanging on nails. I found a heavy crowbar and took it with me, just in case. That's when I started to feel it, like I was being watched. Every time I turned my back to the field, I had this feeling something was behind me. Not moving, just watching. There was no reason for it. It was daylight. I couldn't explain why I felt that way, but it stuck with me the rest of the day. That night, I didn't even bother pretending to sleep. I kept the stove burning low, sat at the table with the crowbar by my feet. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but I was scared. Not of anything specific, just this creeping feeling that something was wrong. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard the sound again. Slow steps outside the cabin. Not rushed, not sneaky, just steady. Then it stopped. I held my breath. I waited for it to move again or for something to happen, but it didn't. I finally stood up, grabbed the crowbar, and went to the door. I didn't open it, just stood there, listening. I waited for maybe 20 minutes before I finally sat back down. At first light, I walked the perimeter again. This time I saw them, footprints, not animal ones, human. boot prints in the soft dirt, walking right up to the front steps and then back into the tall grass toward the cornfield. My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen anyone in days. This place was 15 miles from the nearest town. Who the hell was walking around my cabin in the middle of the night? I packed my stuff right away, threw everything back in the truck and got ready to leave. But the truck wouldn't start. I turned the key again and again, but it just clicked. I popped the hood and looked around even though I had no idea what I was doing. The battery cables looked fine. No obvious reason it shouldn't work. I walked around to the back and that's when I saw it. The wires to the starter had been cut. Not chewed, cut clean. That's when it hit me. Someone didn't want me to leave. The nearest help was too far to walk to safely, especially if someone was out there watching me. I didn't have cell service and there was no landline. I checked the barn again, but there was nothing I could use. I decided to stay inside, lock the door, and wait until morning. I figured I could walk out during daylight. That night was the worst. Around midnight, I heard it again, this time closer, circling the cabin. Slow footsteps. I kept the lights off and sat with my back against the wall, crowbar in my hands. I thought about calling out, yelling, but I didn't want whoever it was to know where I was inside. Then I heard it, the doorknob jiggling. Like, careful. Someone was testing it. They didn't force it, just turned it quietly, like they were seeing if it was unlocked. Then it stopped again. No sound after that. I didn't sleep. I waited all night, stiff from sitting so long, barely breathing. When morning came, I stepped out with the crowbar. The boot prints were everywhere now, all around the cabin. No pattern, just scattered like someone had been walking circles all night. I started walking. I didn't take the road. I cut straight through the field and woods, keeping low, always looking back. Took me most of the day to reach the highway. My legs hurt and my throat was dry. I flagged down a trucker who drove me into town. I told the sheriff everything. He wrote it down but didn't seem too concerned. Said maybe it was just a squatter or a drifter. He sent a deputy to check the cabin. They never found anyone, but the cut wires were still there, and the boot prints too. I never went back. I sold the land that winter cheap just to be rid of it. I still don't know who was out there or why, but it wasn't just one random night. They were watching me the whole time. Maybe they lived in the woods. Maybe they were waiting for something, or maybe they just wanted to scare me off. It worked. I haven't spent a night alone in the woods since.